Picture Aman sitting in a university lecture hall in 1946, teaching chemistry to students who had no more idea that 2 years earlier, the same hands writing equations on the blackboard had signed documents authorizing the production of nerve agents capable of killing thousands of people within minutes. Picture another man receiving a standing ovation at a NASA press conference in 1969. The crowd cheering as he accepted credit for putting human beings on the moon, while in the back of his mind, in a place he had learned never to speak about publicly, he remembered the underground factory where his rockets had been built by men and the women worked. Thus in conditions that belong in the darkest chapters of human history. These were not monsters in the way that were usually understood. They did not look like monsters. They did not think of themselves as monsters. They were scientists, engineers, mathematicians, physicists, men who had spent their entire lives in pursuit of knowledge, of elegance, of the perfect solution to an impossible technical problem. And they built, under the direction of a regime whose nature most of them understood perfectly well, some of the most destructive weapons the world had ever seen. This is the story, and it is one of the most morally complicated stories in the history of science. To understand the scientists of the Third Reich, you have to understand the world they came from. Germany in the early 20th century was, without question, the global center of scientific and technological achievement. German universities dominated every field of advanced research. German chemistry had transformed agriculture, medicine, and the industry. German physics had produced Einstein, Planck, Heisenberg, and Born. German engineering had built the engines, the chemical plants, the electrical systems, and the precision instruments that the modern industrial world ran on. Tibia German scientist in 1930 was to stand at the apex of a profession that your nation had defined. It was a matter of deep national pride and the personal identity. Then the Nazis came to power in 1933, and the world these scientists had built began to change in ways that would ultimately corrupt and destroy much of what made it great. The first change was the Purge, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, passed in April tahun 1933, removed Jewish academics from their university positions across Germany. The effects were immediate and catastrophic for German science. Einstein was in America when Hitler came to power and never returned. Max Born left for Britain. Leo Szilard, who had conceived of the nuclear chain reaction, left for London and eventually America. James Franck, Otto Stern, and dozens of other Nobel laureates and leading researchers departed. Over 1,000 Jewish academics were dismissed from German universities in the first years of the regime. Many of them ended up in Britain and America, where their talents were welcomed and eventually deployed against the country that had expelled them. For the scientists who remained in Germany, a choice had to be made. It was rarely a clean choice, well articulated clearly, well acknowledged even in private, but it was made nonetheless. Some were committed National Socialists who genuinely believed in the regime's ideology. Some were opportunists who saw the departure of Jewish colleagues as a chance for advancement. Some were simply patriotic Germans who believed that their duty was to their country regardless of who governed it, and who told themselves that the regime would moderate, that the worst excesses would pass, that a scientist could serve Germany without serving National Socialism. And some were trapped, their families in Germany, their careers dependent on state funding, their options for emigration closed by circumstance or temperament or simple failure of imagination. What they all shared, to varying degrees, was the willingness to continue their work, to keep the laboratories running, to solve the technical problems that the Wehrmacht and the SS and the Reichsindustrial apparatus put before them. And the problems they were asked to solve were, in several cases, the most significant and the most terrible in the history of applied science. Fritz Haber is the place where this story must begin, even though he died in 1934, before the worst of what followed. He is the man who, more than any other single individual, created the technological foundation that made 20th century warfare possible. He is also one of the most tragic figures in the history of science. Haber was a German Jewish chemist who solved, in 1909, one of the most consequential scientific problems in human history, the Haber-Bosch process, developed with Karl Bosch of BASF, was a method for synthesizing ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen. The implications were extraordinary. Ammonia is the basis of nitrogen fertilizers. Before Haber's process, the world's supply of fixed nitrogen for agriculture was limited to natural deposits of saltpeter, primarily in Chile, and the output of animal waste. Haber's process made it possible to produce fertilizer on an industrial scale from nothing more than atmospheric nitrogen and hydrogen. It has been estimated that roughly half the nitrogen atoms in the bodies of every living human being today pass through the Haber-Bosch process at some point. The process feeds the world. It is, in terms of its impact on human population and the agriculture, among the greatest scientific achievements in history. It is also the process that made the explosive shells of the First World War possible. Explosives require nitrogen compounds. Before Haber's process, Germany's access to Chilean saltpeter was being cut off by the British naval blockade in 1914. And the German military experts had predicted that Germany would run out of explosives within months and be forced to surrender. Haber's process produced synthetic nitrates that kept the German munitions industry running throughout the war. It prolonged the First World War. It prolonged the slaughter of the Western Front. The millions who died in that war between 1914 and 1918, the men in the trenches, the families of the men in the trenches, the lives and the deaths were shaped in part by a chemical process invented by one man. And Haber did not stop, sir. During the First World War, he personally directed Germany's chemical weapons program. He oversaw the development and the deployment of chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in April tahun 1915, the first large-scale use of chemical weapons in modern warfare. He was present at the front when it was deployed. He watched it kill. He went home and celebrated. His wife, Clara Immerwahr, herself a chemist, and the first woman to earn a doctorate from the University of Breslau, confronted him about what he had done. She called it a perversion of science. Days later, she shot herself in the garden of their home with his military pistol. Haber left for the Eastern Front the next morning to supervise more gas attacks. He justified chemical warfare as humane. He argued that a weapon that ended battles quickly and reduced the overall duration of war saved lives in the net. He was wrong, and he likely knew he was wrong, but the logic of the argument gave him something to stand behind. He won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918, partly for the Haber-Bosch process, which genuinely deserved recognition. The scientific community debated loudly whether a man who had weaponized poison gas deserved the honor. The debate has never fully ended. When Hitler came to power, Haber's Jewish identity meant that his 3 decades of service to German science and the German military power counted for nothing. He was forced from his directorship of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. He died in exile in Basel in January 1934, broken and stateless, on his way to Palestine. The country he had served and in one sense saved twice over, once with fertilizer and once with explosives, had discarded him. But the institutions he built and the technologies he developed continued without him. and one of them became the most devastating chemical weapon of the Second World War. Zyklon B, the gas used in the death camps of the Holocaust, was a pesticide developed from research conducted at Haber's Institute. Haber himself had nothing to do with its weaponization for mass murder. He died before the Holocaust began. But the technology that killed his relatives in the camps, including cousins and the other family members who did not escape, was rooted in the chemical research tradition he had built. The bitter irony is so complete that it strains language to describe it. The Norwegians are a different story entirely, and they begin with a man named Gerhard Schrader. Schrader was an organic chemist working for the German chemical company IG Farben in the 1930s. His research focus was pesticides, specifically the development of new insecticides to protect German agriculture. In December 1936, while working on organophosphatic compounds, he synthesized a substance that proved extraordinarily effective at killing insects. It was called tabun. When Schrader and their colleague were accidentally exposed to trace amounts during laboratory work, they experienced immediate symptoms: constriction of the pupils, dizziness, breathlessness, and the terrifying sensation of impending suffocation. Schrader understood what he had found. He reported it to the German military as required by law. The military took one look at tabun and recognized it as the most potent chemical weapon ever created. Tabun belongs to a class of compounds called organophosphatonorvagens. They work by inhibiting the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which normally breaks down the neurotransmitter acetylcholine at nerve junctions in the body. Without this enzyme functioning, acetylcholine accumulates, and the nervous system goes into catastrophic overdrive. Muscles contract uncontrollably, glands secrete without stopping, the lungs fill with fluid, the heart rhythm collapses. Death from respiratory failure follows within minutes of sufficient exposure, and a sufficient exposure could, depending on conditions, be measured in milligrams. The German military immediately classified tabun as a state secret and began development of it as a weapon. Schrader continued his research, and in 1938 he synthesized an even more potent compound. He called it sarin. Sarin was approximately 10 times more toxic than tabun by inhalation. A concentration invisible to the human eye, dispersed in the air over a battlefield, could kill everyone in the affected area within minutes. Serwas, in 1938, no more effective antidote. Serwas no more protective equipment that was simple enough for ordinary soldiers to use reliably. Sarin was, as a weapon, something that the world had never encountered before. The German military built a production facility for tabun at a site called die Herrnfurt in Silesia. By the end of the war, Germany had produced approximately 12,000 tons of tabun and a smaller quantity of sarin, stored in shells, bombs, and bulk containers. These were quantities sufficient to kill millions of people if effectively deployed. They were never used, and the reason they were never used is one of the most debated questions in the history of the Second World War. Hitler knew about the Norwegians. The German military and the political leadership was informed about their existence and their capabilities. Several times during the war, as the military situation deteriorated, the question of deploying them was raised and considered. And each time, the decision was made not to use them. The most commonly accepted explanation is that Hitler, who had himself been temporarily blinded by a British gas attack in October 1918, had a personal horror of chemical weapons that overrode the military arguments for their use. There is also evidence that German intelligence had incorrectly concluded that the Allies possessed comparable Norwegian capabilities, and the German use would trigger Allied retaliation in kind. In fact, the Allies had no more Norwegians. They did not know Norwegians existed until captured German stockpiles revealed them after the war. The deterrence was based on a German intelligence failure, on a false belief in mutual vulnerability that did not actually exist. Had Germany used sarin on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the D-Day landings might have been catastrophically disrupted or destroyed. Had they used it on the Eastern Front against Soviet troop concentrations, the effect could have been decisive in specific battles. The weapons existed, the production capacity existed, the delivery systems existed, and they were never deployed. But the story of the Norwegians does not end with the Second World War. It barely begins, sir. When Allied forces entered the German chemical weapons facilities at the end of the war, what they found shocked them. The scale of production, the sophistication of the chemistry, the existence of sarin, which was completely unknown to Allied scientists. American, British, and the Soviet teams descended on these facilities and they took everything they could. The chemists who had developed the agents, Schrader among them, were extensively interrogated. Their research documents were seized and translated. And within years, all three major Allied powers had established their own Norwegian production programs, built on the chemistry that Schrader had worked out in a German laboratory while trying to kill insects. The Norwegians that have been used in chemical weapons attacks in the decades since the Second World War, in Yemen, in Syria, in the assassination of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in 2018. All of them trace their chemical lineage back to the work done by Gerhard Schrader and his colleagues in the 1930s. The weapons of mass destruction that today represent one of the most serious threats to international security are the direct descendants of German wartime research, now turned from chemistry to physics. Because in parallel with the Norwegian program, in a set of university physics departments and the dedicated research institutes scattered across Germany, a group of the most talented theoretical physicists in the world were working on a problem of a different order entirely. The discovery of nuclear fission was made in Berlin in December 1938 by Otto Hahn and Fred Strassmann, with the theoretical explanation provided almost immediately by Lise Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch, working in exile in Stockholm. Hahn and Strassmann had bombarded uranium with neutrons and found, to their astonishment, that the uranium nucleus was splitting into lighter elements and releasing an enormous quantity of energy in the process. Meitner and Frisch calculated the energy release and provided the theoretical framework that explained it. They coined the term fission, borrowed from biology. The implications were immediately apparent to everyone in the physics community. If a fission reaction could be made to sustain itself, with the neutrons released by each splitting nucleus triggering further splits in other nuclei, the energy released would be of an entirely different order than any chemical explosive. A few kilograms of fissile material, in theory, could release the explosive equivalent of thousands of tons of conventional explosive. It was a weapon of almost incomprehensible destructive potential. Within months of the discovery, both Germany and the United States had established programs to investigate whether an atomic bomb was feasible. The German program, known as the Uranverein, or Uranium Club, assembled under the scientific direction of Werner Heisenberg, who was without question one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists of the 20th century and the founder of quantum mechanics. Heisenberg is the most contested figure in the entire history of Nazi science. The debate about him centers on a single question that has never been definitively resolved. Did Germany fail to build an atomic bomb because Heisenberg made a fundamental error in calculating the critical mass of uranium needed for a bomb? Or did he make that error deliberately, as a form of covert resistance to the Nazi regime? The question was brought into sharp focus by a meeting in Copenhagen in September tahun 1941 between Heisenberg and his former mentor, the Danish physicist Niels Bohr. Heisenberg traveled to Copenhagen, which was then under German occupation, and met privately with Bohr. What was said in that meeting has been disputed by everyone who has ever written about it, partly because Heisenberg and Bohr later gave contradictory accounts of it, and partly because Bohr's written recollections of the conversation, sealed until 2002 and then released by his family, suggest a very different meeting from the one Heisenberg described in his memoirs. Heisenberg's account suggests that he wanted Bohr to discuss the moral implications of atomic weapons research, and to sound out whether physicists on both sides might tacitly agree to avoid developing such weapons. Bohr's account suggests that Heisenberg was fishing for information about Allied atomic research and perhaps seeking Bohr's moral blessing for the German program. The playwright Michael Frayn turned the meeting into one of the most celebrated plays of the late 20th century, precisely because its meaning is irreducibly ambiguous. What is clear is that the German atomic program failed. It failed to achieve a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. It failed to produce the plutonium or the enriched uranium that a bomb would require. It failed to come anywhere close to a deployable weapon, and Heisenberg's calculations of the critical mass required for a bomb were wrong by orders of magnitude, suggesting either a fundamental error or a deliberate miscalculation. The question of whether that error was deliberate matters enormously for how we judge Heisenberg as a human being. If he sabotaged the program, he was a man of extraordinary moral courage, working under conditions where exposure would have meant his death. If the error was genuine, then Germany failed to build an atomic bomb primarily because Heisenberg, for all his brilliance, got the physics wrong. And the German failure was a matter of scientific error rather than moral resistance. The Allied operation that contributed most directly to stopping the German nuclear program came not in a laboratory or a physics institute but on a Norwegian mountainside. The heavy water facility at Vemork, operated by Norsk Hydro in Norway, was the primary source of heavy water for the German nuclear program. Heavy water, deuterium oxide, was needed as a moderator to sustain a nuclear chain reaction in the natural uranium that Germany was working with. Without heavy water, the German program could not proceed. The British Special Operations Executive trained a group of Norwegian commandos who parachuted into the Norwegian mountains in February 1943, made their way on skis through blizzard conditions to the Vemork plant, penetrated its defenses, and destroyed the electrolysis chambers that produced the heavy water without firing a single shot and without any casualties on either side. It was one of the most precise and consequential special operations of the entire war. The Germans repaired the damage and resumed production, but the program's timeline was severely disrupted. When the remaining heavy water stockpile was subsequently transported by ferry across Lake Tins for shipment to Germany, Norwegian agents sank the ferry in the deepest part of the lake, destroying the irreplaceable heavy water cargo. The German nuclear program never recovered its momentum. Without heavy water, without sufficient fissile material production, without the organizational focus and the resources that the American Manhattan Project enjoyed, the German atomic bomb program effectively stalled and ended as a serious weapons development effort. What Germany failed to build, the United States built in 3 years. And it built it partly with the help of scientists who had fled Nazi Germany and brought their knowledge with them. Leo Szilard, who had left Germany in 1933, drafted the famous Einstein-Roosevelt letter that prompted President Roosevelt to initiate American atomic research. Enrico Fermi, Italian rather than German but a product of the same European physics culture, achieved the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction in Chicago in December ke-1942. Hans Bessie, James Frank, and Edward Teller, all refugees from the Nazi regime, were key figures at Los Alamos. The scientists expelled from German science by Nazi racial policy helped build the bomb that was ultimately aimed at Germany's allies. Now we must speak about Rakits. Because the story of Nazi science and its legacy is incomplete without returning to the man we met at the beginning of the story, standing at a NASA press conference in ke-1969. Wernher von Braun was born in 1912 into a Prussian aristocratic family. He was a romantic in the most literal sense of the word, a man animated by a vision so consuming that it organized his entire life around it. He wanted to reach space, not for military reasons, not for national glory, but because he believed, with genuine passion, that the human future lay beyond the Earth's atmosphere. He had been reading science fiction since childhood. He had corresponded with rocket pioneers in his teens. He had joined the German Space Flight Society at 18. Rockets were not a career for him. They were a calling. When the German army offered him funding to develop rockets in the early 1930s, he took it. When the Army's rocket program was incorporated into the Nazi state's military-industrial apparatus, he stayed with it. When SS membership was strongly suggested as a condition of continued access to facilities and the funding, he joined. He later insisted that the SS membership was purely nominal, a bureaucratic formality with no more ideological content. The historical record suggests that this claim, while perhaps psychologically genuine from his perspective, was a morally inadequate response to what he was participating in. The rocket facility at Pienem-Ende on the Baltic coast was, by the standards of the time, one of the most remarkable research establishments in the world. Hundreds of engineers, scientists, and technicians worked on problems that had never been solved before. The aerodynamics of supersonic flight, the guidance of a vehicle through the upper atmosphere using gyroscopes, the design of liquid fuel rocket engines capable of sustained high-thrust operation, the thermal management of a warhead re-entering the atmosphere at thousands of miles per hour. These were not refinements of known technology. They were explorations at the absolute frontier of what human knowledge had yet achieved. Von Braun led this team with a combination of technical brilliance, personal charisma, and the inability to translate between the visionary and the practical that made him invaluable. He knew the theory, he understood the engineering, and he could communicate both to the military authorities who held the purse strings with enough clarity to keep the funding flowing. He was, in purely professional terms, one of the most effective research directors in the history of technology. But Pienem-Ende was not where the V2 was built. The research happened at Pienem-Ende. The production happened elsewhere. In 1943, following the rough raid on Pienem-Ende that killed several hundred people and damaged the facility significantly, the decision was made to move V2 production underground. A vast network of tunnels carved into the Harz Mountains in central Germany became the Mittelwerk, the Central Works. It was a factory unlike any other, and it was staffed, in significant part, by concentration camp prisoners. The camp that supplied the labor was called Dora. It began as a satellite of Buchenwald and eventually became an independent concentration camp, Mittelbau Dora, with tens of thousands of prisoners at its peak. The men who built the V2 rockets in the Mittelwerk worked in conditions of extraordinary brutality. The tunnels were cold, damp, and inadequately ventilated. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts with insufficient food, without adequate clothing, sleeping initially in the tunnels themselves before barracks were eventually constructed outside. Disease, exhaustion. It has been estimated that more people died building the V2 than were killed by it in combat. Von Braun visited the Mittelwerk multiple times. He saw what was happening, sir. He selected skilled workers from the prisoner population for specific technical tasks, which required him to work among the prisoners and observe their conditions. He signed documents requesting additional prisoner labor from the SS. He was not a passive bystander to what was happening at Mittelwerk. He was a participant. However much he later sought to minimize and from that participation, his defense, offered throughout his post-war career, was consistent. He was focused on the rackets. He was not responsible for the conditions in which the labor was provided. He protested when he could. He was powerless within the SS system. There is some evidence that he did raise concerns about prisoner treatment on at least one occasion. There is also evidence that those concerns were limited and episodic, and that they did not in any meaningful way interfere with his primary focus, which was building rackets that worked. The rackets worked, and when they fell on London and Antwerp in the final year of the war, the people who died under them had no more choice about their fate than the prisoners who had built them. Alongside the racket program, German aviation science was producing advances that were transforming what aircraft could do. Ernst Heinkel's company developed the world's first jet-powered aircraft, the He-178, which flew in August 1939, days before the war began. Hans von Ohain, a young physicist who had developed his own jet engine concept largely independently of Frank Whittle in Britain, provided the engine. Von Ohain was 25 years old when his engine first flew. He was motivated by exactly the same spirit of technical inquiry that had driven German science to its pre-war heights, a fascination with the problem, a desire to push the boundaries of what was possible, a relative indifference to the military applications that would flow from his work. The jet engine technology that von Ohain and his colleagues developed became the basis for the Messerschmitt Me 262, which we have already discussed. But the aeronautical science developed in Germany during the war went far beyond the jet engine. Wind tunnel research at German institutions like the Aerodynamische Versatzanstalt in Göttingen explored the aerodynamics of supersonic and transonic flight with a sophistication that allied researchers would spend years catching up with. The swap wing concept, which German engineers had determined was necessary for efficient high-speed flight, and which they were incorporating into advanced aircraft designs by the war's end, became the foundation of every subsequent generation of high-performance military and commercial aircraft. Adolf Busemann, a German aerodynamicist, had presented the theoretical basis for swap-wing design at an international conference in Rome in 1935 in full public view. The significance of his presentation was not widely understood at the time. When Allied technical intelligence teams began processing captured German aeronautical research at the war's end, they found that German wind tunnel data and the swap-wing research had advanced far beyond anything being done elsewhere. American aviation engineers who reviewed the captured data later cited set their programs by years in terms of the conceptual work they would not have had to do if they had understood what Germany had already worked out. The scientists who produced all of this knowledge, Schrader with his Norwegians, Heisenberg with his nuclear research, von Braun with his rockets, von Ohain with his jet engines, Busemann with his aerodynamics, operated within a system that was committing crimes of extraordinary magnitude while their work proceeded. The slave laborers of Dora and the Mittelwerk, the victims of the Norwegian tests conducted on concentration camp prisoners at Natzweiler Struthof and elsewhere, the populations of London and Antwerp targeted by the Fey weapons, the soldiers on both sides killed by German conventional weapons that German science had made more effective. The moral accounting for what these men did is not something that history has ever fully resolved, and perhaps it cannot be. The knowledge they produced was real. The discoveries they made were genuine contributions to human understanding. The technologies they developed shaped the world that came after. And the system within which they produced that knowledge, the system they participated in and sustained and in some cases actively served, was one of the most brutal and criminal in the history of civilization. After the war, the reckoning was incomplete. Operation Paperclip brought von Braun and over 100 of his rocket team to the United States. The British recruited German jet engine and the aeronautical experts. The Soviets took German rocket engineers and the chemists by a somewhat less voluntary process. The Norwegian researchers were interrogated and released. Heisenberg rebuilt German physics in the post-war Federal Republic and spent years defending his wartime record. Most of these men went on to productive post-war careers without facing criminal accountability for anything they had done. The Nuremberg doctors' trial did hold some individuals accountable for the most egregious crimes, the human experiments, the direct participation in atrocity. Sentences were handed down. Some were executed, but the scientists who had built the weapon systems, who had provided the technical foundation for the war machine, who had enabled the killing without directly conducting it themselves, walked largely free into a post-war world that needed their expertise too badly to prosecute them. Von Braun died in 1977. Celebrated as a pioneer of human spaceflight and a hero of American technological achievement. His obituaries in the major American newspapers were overwhelmingly laudatory. The labor of the Dora prisoners appeared, when it appeared at all, in subordinate clauses. The rockets he built that killed people in London appeared, when they appeared, as context for his later achievements rather than as acts requiring moral reckoning. Whether that balance was right is a question that the passage of time has made more rather than less uncomfortable to consider. As the generation that survived the camps has died, as the witnesses have gone, as the physical evidence of what happened at Mittelwerk and Dora has become a matter of historical documentation rather than living memory, the temptation to allow the technological achievement to eclipse the human cost has grown rather than diminished. But the cost was real. It remains real. Thousands of men and women died in the tunnels of the Harz Mountains building rockets. Their deaths do not become less significant because the rockets those same hands built eventually carried human beings to the moon. The achievement and the atrocity are not separate things. They are parts of the same story. And any telling of that story that allows one to disappear behind the other is not history. It is mythology. The Nazi scientists who built the most deadly weapons of the Second World War were not a single type of person. They were not all true believers. They were not all opportunists. They were not all coerced. They were human beings making choices under conditions that ranged from genuine duress to comfortable collaboration. And the choices they made produced knowledge and the capability that changed the world irreversibly. That is the final, unresolvable truth of the story. The science was real. The discoveries were real. The weapons were real. The deaths were real. And the legacy, the Norwegian still being synthesized, the rocket still launching, the jet aircraft still flying, the nuclear deterrent still holding the peace and threatening the peace simultaneously. That legacy is also real. And it surrounds us, and it was built in part by men whose hands were not clean and who built it anyway. Science in the service of power is never neutral. It never has been. The men of the Uranverein and the Mittelwerk and the IG Farben laboratories understood this, on some level, even if they chose not to look directly at what they understood. The knowledge they held made them valuable. The regime they served made them complicit. And the world they helped create, for better and for worse, is the world we still inhabit. The rockets still fly. The Norwegians still exist. The jets still shoot through the stratosphere at speeds that would have seemed miraculous to any previous generation. And somewhere in the foundations of all of it, if you look closely enough, you will find the work of men who made their choices in the shadow of the worst regime of the modern era, and who lived, most of them, to see those choices bear fruit in ways they had always dreamed of, without ever fully reckoning with what those dreams had cost. That silence, the silence around what was known and not said, what was seen and not acknowledged, what was built and who built it, that silence is still with us. It may always be,